Hi, welcome to Common Sense. I'm John.
And I'm Ed. How are you, John?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I think you just came back off vacation. You nice and relaxed?
Pretty much, yeah. It was great. Out in the mountains, doing something completely different. So it was great.
Nice. Good.
How about you? You've been traveling as well.
A little bit of travel, a little bit of late nights watching the Red Sox.
Yeah, well, there is that. So congratulations. Grudging congratulations.
Cool. All right. So today's topic, um, I don't know, maybe this is going to be crossing a bridge too far. We'll have to see. But I think it's really about changing the B2B industrial sales model. And we've talked about this a lot in the context of common sense, and we don't suggest this in some kind of a cavalier way. We know that this is a big change management project. It's a big issue for management. It's more than just some efficiency initiative or some simple Kaizen of it. But this goes to the core of a lot of what we talk about, and it's not based on what's convenient for the company. It's based on adapting to the buyer and to market expectations. And that's I think why we think we're justified in pushing for such a radical solution, because it's not just a change for the sake of change, but it's because the market expects it differently. So to set a little bit of context, let's just kind of compare typical industrial versus kind of a tech sales approach. In the industrial space, we've talked about it. There's small marketing departments, often just a couple people, even for a lower or middle market company. They focus on trade shows. They've got field salespeople that are supposed to manage the demand gen, the lead gen, the prospecting, target account strategy, and even sales channel in many cases. An indirect channel is kind of their force multiplier, if you will. The idea is that their channel partners, distributors, and reps are going to be out beating on doors and finding opportunities. And tech sales, in contrast, the force multiplier is really the marketing department. It's not based on bodies on the street. It's based on what marketing is doing. And the spend is much larger. There's more people. There's bigger budgets. There's more maturity with tools and approaches and campaigns and multiple channels and everything else. And marketing is driving the demand gen and the lead gen in many cases. And that means that from a sales perspective, they have to engage earlier. They often are engaging with leads that would be considered unqualified by traditional standards, with a field sales force. And so that's kind of led to a development of a sales structure that's very different than that traditional industrial field sales structure that I think can teach us some lessons. So take us through that. How would you break that down?
Well, I totally agree. I think that, tech companies spend a whole lot more on marketing, and they put a lot more emphasis on it, especially digital marketing. Partly because they're digital natives. They live in tech space, and they're selling tech solutions. So using tech to get sales makes sense.
Right.
But really, philosophically, it's also that they're selling a different thing. They're selling a problem that's often not well understood or even recognized. And a lot of times, it's a new idea or a new way of doing something that people often do. For example, Uber, a new way of getting a ride somewhere. And their job is to make people aware of that problem or aware of that unique new solution. So there's a lot of marketing involved just by definition.
Right.
And then they typically rely on digital marketing to reach, educate, and often to sell directly to buyers, which
Right.
you don't see in industrial space very often. And then there's usually a business development or sales development function that follows on those inbound leads. So when people, watch a video or get an online demonstration or sign up for a download or something along those lines, there's someone that follows up. And that's, usually automated through a CRM. And so there's often a BDR and an SDR team that does outbound prospecting as well. So they don't just rely on inbound marketing. They also do some outbound marketing, but it's still digital. They're advertising, and then they're following up with a variety of technical, tools like email, chat, video meetings, and less commonly there's an in-person meeting, and that's more common at the enterprise level, I'd say. Less commonly, but still, they do have field and channel sales doing what they've always done, reselling the product. And more often than not, those people do it in person. So there is some overlap. But really, this structure is in place to make sure that the sales reps are most efficient with their time. They're dealing with the right kind of prospects at the right place in the buyer journey, and that, they have sort of an automated checklist of things that happen in order to keep things accountable. So how does this compare to the industrial space?
So, in that model that you described, these inside salespeople, whether the business development reps or BDRs or SDRs or whatever, they're qualifying or disqualifying. They're kind of bird dogging stuff. They're prospecting, and they're setting appointments for the experienced and capable salespeople. And that's a very different model than in the industrial space. And I'd say the easiest place to demonstrate the difference is in follow-up on leads. In the industrial space, it's amazing, whether they're trade show leads that sit, untouched for months, or digital leads that come in that are just dismissed because, they just, downloaded a guide and they're not really a buyer for us, and not really interested. It's amazing the difference in attitude. And I think a lot of it's driven by the expectations of growth and scale. Software companies have investors that expect them to grow 100%. Industrial companies, they couldn't grow 100%. They can't scale it, but they're accustomed to thinking of their world in growth of, 3, 5, 7, 10%. And so it takes a very different sort of a flow of leads to do that. And so there's just a different mindset. I think a question in the industrial space are the inbound leads. Are they being followed up on adequately to justify the investment? People say they need leads. They begin programs with digital to generate leads, but are they getting followed up on? How about leads from paid and editorial sources or even trade shows? In most cases, they're just not getting followed up on very well. And there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, no doubt prospects are harder to reach these days. It's harder to follow up. It's not fun. They say you got to do it 7 times before you actually get somebody on the phone, and then they're not going to remember what they were interested in. You're going to have to go through the whole process. It's hard work. Compensation in many cases, if you look at field salespeople that had a traditional responsibility for prospecting back when you drove around to the shipping door and went in and tried to talk to somebody and then, laying a line card on the counter or whatever, but they're not prospecting now. And maybe the compensation doesn't address that. Complex sales often involve a lot of extensive implementation that the sales reps are involved in many cases, because it's interesting, because they want to preserve the deal, because they feel loyalty to their customer, whatever. They're almost like project managers, which is often an inefficient use of their time. There's a big cultural challenge for many of these companies. The idea of adding layers of staff. I mean, the org chart is the same as it was when the third generation was sweeping the floors and during high school vacations. And it's just expected that the marketing departments are going to be small. There's probably some kind of a technical quoting group in many cases. And then you've got field sales, which is the largest department aside from manufacturing and channel. So if you're talking about adding BDRs and adding inside sales, that creates hesitation. It even creates resistance. There's the first level of, well, how are we going to fund it? But then there's a lot of other disquiet, for the VP of sales. That's kind of the king of the roost. That creates a challenge. It's a very different sort of a function. And you talk about increasing the amount of work that's required for all the content and enablement, and it becomes a barrier in many cases. So I think the interesting conversation to have is around explaining and illustrating the necessity and helping the CEO go through this thought process. We need to grow. We need profitable leads, not just enough leads to sell, but enough leads to skim those that we really want to work with. We have to continuously drive those leads. We have to filter out the noise. We have to nurture the good ones. And how can we automate that? And what part of that potentially could be outsourced if we're uncomfortable adding it ourselves? So that's kind of the conversation to have. But what that dialogue sounds like, who knows? I mean, you've probably got some good insight into that. If you have to help the CEO or CFO think through the importance and the function and come through the process of actually budgeting for it and getting the VP of sales on board to change their worldview, how do they do that?
Well, I think the way not to do that is to throw a bunch of statistics at them and a bunch of marketing jargon and digital tools and try to convince them that this is the best thing to do now, that they're going to be asleep quickly or showing you the door. So really the way to do this is to appeal to what they already know. So, asking them how they buy these days or how their friends and cohorts buy anything.
Right.
Asking them when was the last time they had an in-person sales call and when did they think it was appropriate? They're going to have to say never. And then take them to the point where they acknowledge to themselves that it's really not the way anyone buys anymore. The way they're doing it is just antiquated and it's ineffective. And it shows in their own data. I mean, you can also point them to their own data, which will, surely show the truth. So, it still makes sense. You can explain this. You can soften the blow a little bit. It still makes sense to have a sales team and a meeting that makes sense to iron out, details of the deal and answer questions and build a relationship. All that stuff is still in play here. It's really kind of the front end that needs to be talked about. And so, the next level of this would be, how are you even evaluating sales performance? If they don't even know what's going on or what's being measured, that's going to occur to them that, hey, something's missing here. And it's, in the case of industrial sales, it's almost always how many meetings they had or how many demonstrations they gave. And neither one of those may really represent the interest or engagement of their buyers.
For sure.
There's a big disconnect there. So just gently kind of pointing that out. And then, what's the framework? You mentioned that leads never get followed up on. Well, that's a big problem. How are they doing that if they are at all? And how are they measuring that kind of activity? So when inbound leads come in, through hook or by crook, by Google or whatever it is, who's going to do something about it and how? And then, maybe there's a disconnect between them and their buyers. Their chances are there are. In our book, Common Sense Revenue Growth, that's the number one problem.
Right.
They don't really understand what buyers want and what they want in terms of, education along the way and, resources that are available at their fingertips for, when they do that Google search, what do they find out about your products and services without being too pushy? So, there's a lot of that involved that they may not understand. And, looking at the bottom line is also important. What percentage of the market is actually buying at any time, at any given time? What's the opportunity out there that they're missing? So
Right.
pointing some of that out is important as well. And then, just kind of going to what's next. How much change can they swallow? What might be a possible solution for them? Even taking some baby steps, to find a working solution. So how would you approach that conversation?
Well, that's an interesting practical and philosophical question. I mean, should an industrial manufacturing company create leads with inbound marketing? I mean, I think we both agree that they should, but it's very different than how they've done it. Should they follow up on them? We would say certainly. If you're going to create them, you got to follow up on them, but amazingly, it doesn't happen often. Should they prospect proactively outbound in addition to inbound marketing? Of course. I mean, that's business 101. You've got to be doing that, but it's not happening very much. Or I guess, should they just wait for empowered buyers to find them and start the conversation, which is realistically what a lot of these companies are doing now. So those are questions that are on the table in the context of that discussion that you outlined. And I hear a lot of people talking about these kinds of things. What's interesting is, like so much in our world today, it seems to be a binary conversation. We're going to market or we're not. We only want to talk to qualified leads, or, we will talk to anybody. I mean, things get split in this way that I think just really does a disservice, because these are really complex questions in many cases. The clear part is really that what business does is creates demand and creates leads if they're doing it well. And the question then is, are they focusing on buyers whom they can really improve the condition of versus just browbeat them into buying something? And a lot of times, if you look at forecasts, it's about, geez, can we just get them to buy? Give them a big enough discount so they buy it by the end of the quarter, not how is this going to change their business a year from now? So, we can kind of shift, not should we market, how we market, or not should we market, prospect, and sell, but how do we do those things? And so if we can kind of get to that point and agree on that, then the question is, do you want your field salespeople following up on something like a white paper or a guide download? Probably not. Maybe in some cases, if you combine it with other signals and it appears that there's been 3 people from the same company, they've been on a bunch of pages of the site, they're looking at the pricing page, maybe that's a decision stage opportunity that a sales rep does want to follow up on. But in other cases, not. I mean, sometimes it's the college kid looking for material for reference for their report that they're doing. So I think it doesn't make sense to just default to the field sales. But that means, coming back to this question about the org chart, you have to have some kind of lead management and qualification. And that could be BDRs, it could be inside sales, but there's got to be some function. And then how are you going to do the prospecting? It's simply not happening in most cases. Do you want the field salespeople doing it? Yeah, I think it makes sense. And I think that amazingly many CEOs and VPs of sales believe that it's happening, maybe kind of understand emotionally that it's not, but don't want to push the point. But even if you push the field salespeople to do it, you're not going to be there with them. You can't make them do it well. And if their compensation isn't tied to it, they may just submit the list or check the box or do whatever they need to and not really do it. They can send a few boilerplate emails, say, yes, I reached out to 4 companies, without any real chance of success and no significant downside for not doing it. So I'd rather have a tightly controlled and measured system for that kind of outbound prospecting. So that kind of brings us back. That's probably a BDR function again, using prospecting playbooks and CRM and type processes and editing scripts and templates based on how they're performing. So we're kind of, if these functions, if following up on the leads needs to have some kind of an inside sales or BDR, if prospecting needs to have some kind of inside sales or BDR, and there's this combination of this requirement but a hesitance, then do you want to try to hire and train for these positions that haven't been in your org chart, that you don't have the skills internally, you don't have people that can mentor that have done the kind of work? So that kind of brings us to the point of potentially outsourcing. I think at least the BDR function, and there are services that do that. You could route inbound leads to them as well. You could provide buyer intent data to them to follow up on. You could build lookalike audiences for nurturing to generate some more leads for them. The interesting thing is that if you look at what some of these outsourcing opportunities cost, the price is not a lot different than hiring somebody internally, particularly if you account for training time and holidays and overhead and the ramp up time, the inefficiencies inherent in doing it yourself. But, and this is a big but, the industrial companies I talk to always hesitate at this point because they say, no, our stuff is so technical, it takes years of experience, and only if you've been in the field doing it for years and years do you know how to sell it. And how could somebody that's outsourced as a BDR possibly manage to have a conversation and get us an appointment? And I say the answer to that is actually pretty simple, because you're misunderstanding. They're not selling your product. All they're doing is selling the expertise of your sales rep and setting a meeting. I mean, that is the function of a BDR: qualification, nurturing, and setting a meeting. So that critical step feels to me like something that could be outsourced, perhaps brought in-house, but it's definitely a different function. You agree?
Yeah, I do. I think, it's tough, like, as you said, to figure out who's qualified to do what. A lot of people will hire BDRs, or at least put them in that position, with relatively little experience. And they might be good at sort of trying to convince you to take a call with an inside sales rep, but that's about it. If you have any technical questions or you really want to explore the value proposition of the product, they're not equipped to do that. So that's one challenge. And then, so what do you do about that? Well, I think one thing you could do is actually move your inside salespeople into that BDR role or combine them in some way. Now that makes it harder on the whoever that new hybrid rep is, because maybe the compensation isn't there for all the time they're spending. But I think you'll find that, or at least they'll find that it's a lot easier to not just qualify somebody or make sure they're qualified, but also, get further along in the sales process. So the journey, is shortened by someone who's really an expert taking that first call. And maybe the prospect actually has some other interest other than, what they originally, maybe they put in a form or something like that, or they downloaded a piece of content. So they might have another problem that an expert could really uncover. And so that increases the chance of a sale, maybe even exponentially. So there's a really good case in terms of closing sales and being more efficient to sort of combining these roles or outsourcing them, as you mentioned. You could do both. But I think, clearly the way we're doing it now, having an inexperienced person just asking 20 questions at the beginning just turns people off, and it's not going to lead to anything.
Especially when they hand it off and the next person asks the same 20 questions again.
Yeah, exactly. Because they don't even communicate. They don't have a CRM. They don't, log phone calls.
Right.
They don't uncover the real challenge. They're just kind of asking a bunch of questions. So that whole part of it is clearly broken. And, I think a good first step might be to try, moving some of that inside sales stuff into more of a hybrid role, or even clearly a BDR role that has closing capability, or trying the outsource method. Both could be effective. So I guess those are my thoughts. What are your next thoughts on where to go from here?
I think you have to solve the compensation piece, because the way these companies are set up, the field salespeople are the ones making the money for the sales. And now you're talking about people that you're going to have to incent to put up with the abuse of being a BDR, people that you're going to have to incent for being inside sales and nurturing deals over a long term. And that means there's actually less of a direct correlation between the field sales people are doing and the ultimate sales. And so, there's going to be change management dealing with that. Job descriptions and pay is going to have to be changed. I think BDRs and inside sales and field sales need to have different and clearly defined responsibilities, but they need to operate as a team. They can't be silos, and the compensation has to be complementary, and the motivations have to be as well. They can't be competing, and sales managers and leadership team need to be willing to change the approach to sales as a whole, not just kind of, oh, well, we'll hire somebody to do a few phone calls, but leave everything else in place. That means reorganizing teams, giving them the tools that they need to succeed. I'd say one question, target accounts. It's amazing how many companies don't have a list of target accounts. In some cases, they have a few national accounts that are house accounts handled by a different sales team, but they don't have target accounts beyond that. They may have a couple key accounts where they've sold a lot of equipment, but they don't know who the 100 target accounts or 500 or 50 or whatever it is. That needs to be a collaborative effort between inside and field sales, because there's a lot of biz dev associated with target accounts. There's also a question about how much of these functions can be enabled or automated with technology. And that's something that we haven't talked about. We've talked about how they would use technology in doing the job. But what about replacing some of these functions with technology? I mean, you're the MarTech guy. What do you think?
Well, I think there's certainly an opportunity there. And you mentioned target accounts. What better way to understand what your target accounts should be than looking at your own data, looking at the customers that you have, and looking at some lookalikes to those customers. What characteristics of that data match, a good customer for you, or, one that has a lot of repeat buys, for example, or expanded sales, or, they pay on time. It could be a lot of different things, but it would really help, in order to sort of prospect new target accounts, knowing what's a good customer look like. So that's one place you could do that. And then in terms of sales itself, I think there's a lot of room for enablement. The automation side is still somewhat limited. You don't have these bots or chat features on websites that really know enough to answer intelligently yet. I think that's coming in the future, but especially in complex sales, I don't think there's a lot of room for that just yet. I think it's a great customer experience to be able to reach out and get it in touch with someone quickly to answer your questions, but that still needs to be probably an inside salesperson or someone who has that experience. At the very least, a BDR needs to be sitting at the other end of that, getting you in touch with the right people. So, it's coming along, but I think the automation side has a lot of potential, especially when you think about customizing, the communications back and forth between you or your team and the customer or prospect. What do those people want? What are they interested in? What pages have they visited? What things have they downloaded? What specific problem are they trying to solve? A lot of that could be uncovered with automation, and then the right content or the right people could be hooked up with that prospect in order to make that first call or second call much more effective. So
right.
I don't think we're going to be replacing salespeople with bots anytime soon, but it is promising that certainly their jobs will be made easier on the prospecting side and then on the follow-up side as we've been talking about. So I think, as we wrap this up, it sounds to me like we're saying that traditional B2B needs more marketing, more inbound lead follow-up, more outbound lead prospecting, and a bigger role somehow with inside sales, communicating sooner with the prospects rather than just waiting and, frustrating them with a bunch of questions. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think so. I guess the bottom line, the biggest difference is this BDR function. And my concern is that in many cases, it's not a great organic fit just because the culture is very traditional, slow to change, and it would really be disruptive. And so I think that it's probably best approached assuming that it's going to be outsourced. And if you can do it in-house, great. But I'd keep an eye out for ways to automate it. I think that I believe that we're further along than you do. I mean, there's natural voice bots that you can give a script to. I mean, they can't interact yet, but they can have very natural phone calls, reminders, or thank yous, or whatever the case may be.
Sure.
So it's a critical function, and getting that inside sales piece working, I think, is going to be as important for industrial companies to qualify and generate leads and nurture sales as it has become for sales companies. And so just as a thought experiment, I toss out one more thing for CEOs of companies like that. Just imagine if you took your top field salesperson that maybe is tired of dealing with airports and hotels and whatever, and brought them in-house. What would your sales process look like in that case? That's, I think, an interesting thought experiment.
I agree. That's an interesting idea, and it may save some of the pain of moving all the chess pieces around in a radical way. And I do think that the question of automation has a lot of potential. It's also a good segue to our next topics, which is going to be how MarTech can help companies keep pace with these changing buyer expectations. So until then, thanks for joining us. I'm John.
And I'm Ed. If you think there's value to this, you want more of this kind of stuff, then subscribe to these videos or subscribe to our podcast, or, better yet, do all three. Grab a copy of our book, Common Sense Revenue Growth, as well. So thanks for joining John and me. I'm Ed, and together we're Common Sense.
See you next time.